This episode of the Managing Madrid Podcast is brought to you by the Beverly Hilton. This summer, dive into the Beverly Hilton's iconic past and present, from golden hour and 1950s inspired cocktails to live music, exclusive poolside events and partnerships. This is the summer you've been waiting for. Follow in the footsteps of Hollywood's elite and become part of their legacy when you book your summer stay at the Beverly Hilton. Listeners, for those of you guys traveling to Los Angeles for Real Madrid's preseason game at the Rose Bowl in July, make sure to book your stay at the Beverly Hilton. On that note, link to book your spot to our podcast in Houston is in the show notes. Do that before July 1st. Coming up is a really fun episode that I really enjoyed recording and I think you'll enjoy listening to. Seb Stafford-Bloor of The Athletic and Tifo Football joined the podcast to discuss his article over on The Athletic about Jude Bellingham. Well worth the read, and we kind of did a deep dive on what he wrote about Bellingham, and I think you're going to come away with some really cool tidbits and even more than you already have been impressed with Jude Bellingham, the human, and not just the footballer. Also on the website today, my column on Real Madrid's next striker. Who will the number 9 go to, if not Joselu? Because obviously Joselu got number 14. And huge Bellingham visual analysis by Yash Thakur is also pinned on the website. Go check that out. All right. Without further ado, here is the podcast with Seb. Let's go.
Nice article in the Managing Madrid blog. Wonderful lads that do a great job there, and worth reading about that man there. Karim Benzema needs to rest, and the numbers reveal why.
Times ended up almost looking like a 6-3-1. Some very good writing about that on the Managing Madrid website. First-rate podcast as well. Of course, Fede Valverde was a huge part of the equation.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Managing Madrid Podcast. I'm your host, Kiyan Sobhani. We got a special guest on today's show, Seb Stafford-Bloor, football writer and head of Tifo Football's illustrated channel, also a writer for The Athletic. All of those brilliant Tifo Football videos you see, animated perfectly, narrated beautifully with an incredible voice. A lot of that is orchestrated by Seb. And it's a pleasure to have Seb on the show because he wrote a banger of an article about Jude Bellingham, which we'll go through. But I did want to introduce Seb and also just welcome him on his Managing Madrid Podcast debut. Seb, welcome, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Kiyan. Thank you very much for having me.
I did have Joe on. I think it must have been a couple years ago. Maybe, I don't know if it was during the pandemic. Joe came on. He kind of like talked about the history of Tifo Football and I got to say, like, following the evolution of it has been really amazing. And I remember saying this to Joe a couple years ago that it's very rare that you see a YouTube video about football, which is it can be such a polarizing thing. Like, people argue all the time about football. But Tifo Football, like, if you go in the comments, it's just, like, unanimously, universally loved. Everyone's like, this is amazing. It's just great work, and I have a lot of admiration for the way you guys tell the stories and present it. So congratulations on setting up an incredible channel, man.
That's really generous. Well, most credit goes to Joe because it's Joe's idea and his execution, and I kind of done my bit over the years. But it's he's been our fearless leader. But we do have a few dissenting voices in the comment section, but we never try and provoke people. I think that's kind of our aim, is just to be informative when we can and entertaining. We don't try and get people to rage or anything like that, or we're not one of those. But no, that's very, very kind. It's lovely to hear too. Thank you.
So you wrote an article, I guess it was last week, and it's entitled "Jude Bellingham is Different: A Portrait of Real Madrid's New Superstar." I would urge everyone to go read it. I'll link in the show notes, and I think a lot of people listening to this have probably already read it. We have a Discord channel, and I saw this article being shared and commented on in our Discord channel, and people really enjoyed it. I think it's impossible to go through the entire article because it's quite lengthy, and you can see like a lot has gone into the work with the research and the people you've gotten to speak about it, including academy coaches from when Bellingham was younger. So we won't do that. People should go read it. And I think this profile was interesting, Seb, because it goes a lot into his Birmingham days and his upbringing. And I've just kind of highlighted some parts of the article which really stood out to me. But I guess I just wanted to start with this question. Is there anything specific that spurred you to write about this topic and focus on this angle of Bellingham?
It's a great question. I don't think so. I think when I was asked to do the profile, I think, as with any topic like this, I think you want to do justice to the human being. You want to be fair, and you also want to recognize what goes into the production and the makeup of a professional footballer. Because I think over time, I think because we're all, we all have so amazing resources at our disposal just as fans, right? So, you can go on FBref or who scored or, Opta. So over time, as a result of all these things, a football player can become a kind of an aggregation of data. And it becomes really easy because of the stardom these guys have and the celebrity and the stage they perform on. Particularly a club now like Real Madrid, it gives footballers almost a holographic quality. And I suppose it also suits my personality. I'm not a tactics writer. I'm not hugely interested in that. And the actual sort of cut and thrust of games is important. But I think what really interests me is the people and the way they react to changing circumstances and the way they handle things. And I think what's interesting about Jude Bellingham is that for as long as most people can remember, great things have been expected of him. And at every stage of his career, despite all these sort of external forces, many of which we're not really party to as fans, media, writers, whatever, because they happen behind closed doors. They happen in, when family members, mothers and fathers are ferrying boys to training and making all the sacrifices that any family makes in any sport for any aspiring professional. But at every challenge that he's faced, he's kind of conquered, and his rise has been amazing, and his ability to handle expectations and I hope this doesn't sound too corny or trite, but one of the things, and when you write an article like this, some of the people you speak to provide you quotes, others are just there to provide background. And it's one of the first times I can remember speaking to people, and universally, people praised the person. They talked about how humble he was and how well brought up he was and also how little things like when the people at Birmingham City who weren't necessarily fundamental to the kind of the technical development of his career, so club staff, people like that, he sort of, his behavior around those kind of people was exemplary, which isn't always the case, as I'm sure you know. Like you sometimes do hear stories, unfortunately, about young stars who have a little bit of an ego about them and develop a little bit of premature gravitas. And this isn't one of those players. This is just a very decent, humble, well brought up person. And I feel like it feels very, very important. But I dug into that because I think that the next stage of his career other things will become more important. What he produces at Real Madrid, you either win or it doesn't really matter, right? That's my kind of understanding of the club. I've never covered football in Spain, only England and Germany. But so I wanted to sort of describe those things while the chance existed, I think.
I think that's part of the reason why I enjoyed your article, was that it focused on who he is. Because so much of like our work with getting to know Bellingham before signing him was focused on his scouting report as a footballer. Okay, he can do this, he can play in this position and that position, and these are his strengths. This is how he helps the team. But I'll speak for myself. I didn't know that much about who he is. I think one of the things we were blown away with, and I think a lot of the media in Madrid and Spain were kind of blown away as well, was during his presentation, we were like, oh, this guy is like, has a presence. He's classy. He's well spoken. He's humble, and I think that he was just really impressive. He was an impressive figure sitting there and giving great quotes. Not nervous at all, like very confident in himself. And we were just kind of impressed of who he is, and so much of the dialogue around Real Madrid's Champions League success last season, when they had those comebacks and they won the Champions League, was about team unity and how there's no egos in the locker room. The leaders are Modric, the leaders are Benzema, Kroos. These guys don't have like this baggage, and I think Bellingham fits in with, Camavinga is another one that we recently signed. Tchouaméni they all have these traits in common, which is nice, and I think that is an undervalued thing. Like, again, there is no, like you said, you brought up Football Reference, and there is no line, 99th percentile in charisma or humility, right? And those are things that are a little bit immeasurable, but as you said, you can kind of measure it in you speak to everyone, and he's universally loved. So I thought that was really cool to see.
I think also, like, one of the things, like, you're 100% right. There's no 99th percentile for character, humility, but also it's worth saying that I think it's a real privilege to be able to go and watch live football these days, because of geography, because of cost. These opportunities aren't available to everybody, and so people don't get the chance to, for instance, stand in the stadium when Jude Bellingham's playing in front of the yellow wall at Dortmund. And I think you can tell a lot about a footballer from those moments. You can tell how their own supporters respond to them, and how, what someone can handle. So, for instance, for those who haven't been to the Westfalenstadion in Dortmund, 80,000 people, it's loud, and it's everything that you think it is on TV. And I remember the first time I saw him play there, the way that he almost, and this was referenced by Stefan, who I spoke to in the article, the way he kind of conducts the crowd, and the way that there's that bond between him and them, which is very interesting. It's also very rare for a young guy who, English footballers don't typically travel very well. Some have to Dortmund recently, sure, but historically, no. And yet, his ability to handle that, and I'd say a fierce old place, Dortmund. I know it's not Real Madrid, but it's no small club, and I think you can tell, a lot about what a player represents and what he means to a club, and that's often a reflection of who they are as a person, but also what their playing personality is, and I think these things are really important, and they always will be. I think that if you look at sort of Real Madrid's, what you probably describe as the kind of the next generation of Real Madrid's midfield, so that sort of the post-Modric Kroos era, like in Tchouaméni and Camavinga, you've got guys, there are no character problems there, right? There's no controversy, and there's no baggage. These are just good footballers, but also good human beings as well, by all accounts, that's, as far as I'm aware. And Bellingham is very much in that category. So I have to believe that this is part of, as elaborate as his technical abilities are, like this is a kind of an equal part, I'm sure, of the attraction.
Well, you mentioned this in your article too, because there's like, you didn't outright say this, but this is kind of how I interpreted it as when you're talking about his humility.
Yeah.
But the way I interpreted it, your article was that, you can't really mistake the humility for weakness or meekness, because, and you brought up the example where he talks about the referee who has the match fixing, and
so I just jump in there, Kiyan, he was that referee, Felix Weyer, in the Bundesliga. He was there was a match fixing scandal in 2006 in Germany, and one referee was banned for life. And as Felix Weyer was found to have taken a cash payment from that referee, he was never found guilty of altering or impacting games, but he exists under the suspicion of that controversy all those years ago. That's what Jude Bellingham was alluding to.
So you said that there's a combative side of his personality that should serve him well in Madrid. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think what's important is that we talk about throwing around words like humility a lot so far, but he knows exactly how good he is. And I think you can tell that by his demeanor on the pitch, by his confidence on the ball. This is not someone that will struggle with what life is probably like at Real Madrid. This is somebody who knows. I think one of the reasons why, and I think you're right, you observe the kind of the comfort in front of the cameras during his unveiling at Real Madrid. I think one of the reasons why that's probably easy for someone like that is, well, he belongs there because he's good enough to be there. Like he's not going there to be intimidated by lining up alongside Modric, Kroos, Tchouaméni, Camavinga, because I'm sure he has plenty of healthy respect for these people, but this is his platform in the game. And I think what became evident at Dortmund very, very quickly, and it's worth remembering that Jude Bellingham was the youngest captain and the youngest player to captain a Bundesliga team in the history of the league, which is an amazing thing. But also, when a teenager comes to a foreign country and they're willing to kind of hold their teammates to a certain standard, or if they don't meet that standard, to tell them and to point it out pretty obviously and pretty firmly, I think that speaks to kind of what your own professional standards are. And I think that's something you have to be equipped with at Real Madrid. Like from the outside, it does look like a harsh environment. It's not a place for self-doubt. In fact, there are plenty of players there who, I always think of Rafa van der Vaart, actually, in terms of what happens to gifted players who don't fully believe they're good enough to be there. Wesley Sneijder, maybe another one. Like these guys who have all the technical ability in the world, but probably not the kind of that sort of ice vein conviction that I see in Bellingham. Like there's no such thing in football as a straight arrow. It just isn't. But you look at kind of what's likely to happen, and how equipped somebody is to be in certain situations, and it's a perfect match. It's a perfect match, it's been very interesting to see. I don't think I've ever seen it so quickly. It's like a player grow into a leadership role at a new club so quickly, and when they're so young too. It's very rare, and it's something that you tend to notice.
A lot of these things, these are great signs for coming to a club like Real Madrid, where you need to handle pressure. Obviously, there's no sure things in football. You never know. Bellingham seems to be different. And hopefully he is. There was a few things, and you mentioned the captaincy at Dortmund. You also mentioned in your article that Birmingham actually retired the 22 shirt. Yeah. And that blew my mind. I actually didn't know that. That's an incredible thing to do for a player who left the club at such an early age. It's not like, Diego Maradona. This is, does that strike you as just a little bit crazy that they would do that for a player his age?
Yeah. So yes, I think it did for everybody, because in England, it doesn't really exist in the culture in the same way that it does in, for instance, US sport, right? I know it's still an honor, but for instance, the Manchester United number 7 shirt has never been retired. It's been worn by Best and Beckham and Cristiano Ronaldo, and it just doesn't happen in football, and it definitely doesn't happen to players who are 16. So I remember when I heard that, thinking, it's kind of eyebrow raising, right? Like I think a lot of people in the English football industrial complex had a bit of fun at Birmingham's expense and sort of laughed at them a little bit. But actually, the more I learned about it, and the more I kind of challenged my own ignorance about what he meant to the city of Birmingham and the people there, the more I kind of understand it. Like it's still a bit strange. I don't think there's any getting away from that, but I get the gesture. It feels like, to me, and this is just my interpretation of it, Kiyan, is that they knew where he was headed. And also, hey, listen, put it in its right context. Jude Bellingham was born 15 miles from Birmingham. Jude Bellingham is a son of the Black Country itself, which is gets its name from being part of the old industrial heartland in the West Midlands in the UK, for people that don't know the geography. Is very important in the same way that it is for any club, like a young player comes through. Also, Birmingham City have their modern history, their recent history is extremely troubled. They've had some very difficult times with owners, which is a podcast of its own, probably. Very difficult financial situations. And Bellingham, I suppose, if you put him in the centre of all of that, he's your local boy made good. He is, and I'm sure he'll prove this, he is going to probably be one of the most talented English players of all time, once his career is up. Like in terms of where is he expected to be, he exists in that kind of Rooney stratosphere in the sense that people knew about him before he'd even played a game. Like people knew the name before they'd watched him play or saw him score a goal or anything like that, or before Dortmund or for Real, of course. And so when you add all of those things together, you create a player that means an awful lot to a club and to a part of the world, and to, as I said earlier, to a lot of the people that came into contact with him. And so it's strange, but it's kind of touching. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of cynicism in football. Rightly, there should be, but sometimes it's okay for earnest things to exist, and that's one of them. Whether it's for everybody's taste, I don't know, but I can understand it a bit more, having learned a little bit about it.
One of the parts of the article that I thought was really cool to read was about his coachability, and that he's open to, I don't know if criticism is the right word, but at least the challenge of improving certain aspects of the game. So there's that quote from Pep Clotet.
Yeah.
Is that how you say his last name? Clotet?
Yes.
Yeah. Obviously, has coached in a variety of places, and he was at Birmingham at the time that Bellingham was there. And he has a quote. He says, quote, "He's very, very easy to work with because he has high standards and puts high expectations on his own work." And Clotet later goes on to say, "It was only ever a matter of challenging him. When he did something bad, I could tell him, I could say, Jude, that's not good. That's not what we want. He would just say, you're right. We'll see tomorrow." Straight away, he would make it better. He'd recognize the mistake, then solve it and sort it. Jude gets respect from everyone because he puts in all the effort and mentality and gets results. I'm curious to know what those things to improve are at Real Madrid. I don't know if that's necessarily the point of the podcast, but did you get a sense of like what he is? I mean, in the article you mentioned, his ability to play multiple positions. What could he improve on at Real Madrid, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose the right way to answer it is to remember that when he arrived at Dortmund, I think if people reflected on that now, they would say he developed quicker than everybody really anticipated that he would. He also arrived at a time where Dortmund's midfield was not necessarily in a good shape. Like it wasn't sort of the midfield that Jurgen Klopp had 10 years ago, for instance. And whilst towards the end of last season, with Emre Can as the pivot and kind of offering protection, like it was balanced, and Julian Brandt was playing really well and all these things. But in the beginning, Bellingham, it felt watching him as if he was trying to play all the positions at the same time, because he was the most gifted player and he's sort of aware of it. And also he's young and inexperienced, and it was his first exposure to actual top flight football. He never played in the Premier League. He'd only played something like 40 championship games, which is the second tier in England. It's a huge leap up. And also you got the impression that with all of this ability, and particularly creative ability and technical ability on the ball, came this desire to be impactful all the time. So I think there's a little bit of that left in him. I think sometimes he takes risks where he maybe shouldn't, but then that's a responsibility that Real Madrid hold. You have to, if you want to make the most out of a player like Jude Bellingham, you have to create the parameters within which he operates. So you need to provide a bit of security behind. You need to make sure that the players ahead of him can benefit from his passing vision off both feet, all those kind of things. Fullbacks are in the right position, etc., etc. Whether he could play as the deepest man in the midfield, I don't know. I don't know if his positioning is quite there yet. So there are some rough edges, but then that's what Real Madrid are buying, is like the ability to kind of to take this set of attributes and create something around him. And I mean, look, I don't know if this is correct. I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Real Madrid have the players at the club now where they could select the same 3 or 4 guys for the next 8 years in midfield. Potentially, I know football often doesn't kind of work out like that, but that would be the idea, is to create permanent homes for Tchouaméni, Camavinga, Bellingham. Still got Fede Valverde there, of course, and allow him to kind of specialised, because I don't think he got the opportunity to do that at Dortmund towards the end, but I think a lot of his career was defined by what they didn't have, and that's kind of reflected in the fact that they were only really competitive for the league in his final season, and then of course he got injured towards the end, sadly. But so having a strength of, and the other thing to remember is that Jude Bellingham has shown sort of these abilities with a good set of teammates around him, but not exceptional. Like, I would say in that Dortmund side, Branton is an exceptional player. Royce might not be anymore. Chan is a very good player. Mats Hummels behind him. Adeyemi is a developing player rather than an exceptional one already. Daniel Marlin is a good player without being an exceptional one. Sebastian Haller, great story, good player, not Erling Haaland, right? So a lot of the discovery is yet to come, because all of a sudden you put him in a team with Vinicius Junior, Rodrigo, Hosselu, still don't quite understand that, but okay. But Tchouameni, Camavinga, like these guys, this is I think it's kind of, if that's the prism, if that's the kind of the way to multiply someone's influence, imagine what you could do with someone who is as talented as Jude Bellingham.
Yeah, that's the hope. You surround him with even better players. Sure. Although, like, you know, if Real Madrid don't get a striker, then maybe Bellingham's assist numbers won't look too flashy next season. I'm not sure how that's going to go. We'll see. Me neither.
That's a weird one. I saw Hosselu play at Stoke, so I'm sure he's got a lot better since then. But
well, the hope for Real Madrid fans is that Hosselu is going to be the backup and not the starting striker.
Right.
But
who's supposed to be the 9 next season?
The guy that we've been flirting with for 3-4 years.
So the expectation is that's going to happen? Really?
I don't know.
Okay.
You never know with this kind of stuff. I mean, like, you just can't predict it. But that's what's being written in the Spanish press and some of the French press, and then also, but we know it's going to be somebody, because
it has to be. It'll have to be somebody.
Hosselu didn't get the number 9, so that no one in the squad has the number 9. So
that's right. He was 14, isn't he?
To see who that player is. I did want to ask you this to close the podcast, because in the article you kind of lead with the chart that shows Bellingham as the second most expensive British player of all time. Obviously, we know Gareth Bale was in the top 3. Grealish is number 1.
Yeah.
There is this, and you mentioned it at the top of the podcast, this idea that not all English players succeed abroad. With Real Madrid, we've had several. And I think, generally speaking, Bale was a success.
Yep.
Beckham was well loved in Madrid, and I think played really well, despite it being a signing for marketing purposes initially. Owen was a weird one because we didn't need him, but he actually had a pretty good goal scoring ratio. Yeah, he was okay.
He was all right.
Cunningham was fantastic, though he had injury concerns. You guys did a great video about Cunningham actually at Tifo Football, I think a couple of years ago or so.
There's a great book about him, by the way, if you can dig that out. I forget the title, but if anybody, it's a lovely story about Laurie Cunningham. But his life story is worth telling too.
Yeah, and it's a story worth consuming and reading and learning about, because he's an incredible figure. And that's an entire podcast of himself, Cunningham. But I guess this is a long-winded question, but the question is, do you see the fact that he's a British player playing in Real Madrid, do you see that as a barrier, or do you wish to kind of put those concerns or myths to bed?
Great question. I think I see him as a kind of part of the new breed of English footballer, British footballer, in that they're very international. So one of the problems with British footballers in the past was that they created players who couldn't play outside England. Like they not couldn't, but just didn't fit in really. Like, they weren't technique-based players. They weren't multi-positional. They couldn't perform multiple roles. They were designed, and I'm going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is why people like Laurie Cunningham are interesting, is because they were different. But if you go back that far, I think you got a lot of players who fit into a 4-4-2, who could, who would perform one of the kind of typical roles within that system. Bellingham he's typical of the kind of the new generation of player that England has been trying to produce since probably about 2010, when kind of, I think when England came back to the 2010 World Cup, they sort of realised we've got a bit of a problem here. With, like it just doesn't work. Our Gerrard, our Lampard, they don't translate into stars outside of the Premier League, or they don't have some of the abilities, the requisite abilities for international football. Bellingham's not like that. Bellingham is if you were to watch him in a park, right? If you and I were just walking around somewhere and you saw him kicking a ball with his friends, you wouldn't be able to tell where he grew up by the way he played, right? So in the same way that like maybe 30 years ago, and if you walk past a park in Valencia and you saw Pablo Aimar dribbling a football, you'd be like, he's a South American playmaker, right? Because just the whole thing it's so typical. Bellingham could come from anywhere. He's just he's a kind of a child of the game, so to speak. That's pretty pretentious, but I think you know what I'm getting at. So I don't see that as an issue. It's worth remembering too that he's got two really supportive parents who have already dealt with this challenge. So when he lived in Dortmund, he wasn't actually old enough to drive when he got there. And his mum was over here, his mother Denise, and I think she spent most of the time with him in Dortmund. His father Mark was over here a little bit. He's got a younger brother, Job, who's just signed for Sunderland. So they were kind of balancing, obviously, two children in two different countries. So they know what they're about. And I'm sure that Real Madrid, given the amount of money invested, will do everything they can to kind of ease the adjustment. But no, I've got no fears. Like 20 years ago, I think we all did. Like when you never knew how. See Steve McManaman coming over to Real Madrid and Jonathan Woodgate. You never really knew what that was going to look like, right? But I think now these are paths trodden before, and the game is an international one, and the type of footballers that England produces are international in nature, and he above all others, really. So no technical concerns. Like I expect it to go extremely well for him.
Seb, this was awesome. Thank you so much for just putting some time aside for this podcast. I appreciate that a lot. Everyone, please go read Seb's article in The Athletic. It's linked in the show notes. You can click on it directly. Also, you can follow him on Twitter at SebSB. And Seb, thanks so much. I really appreciate this.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, thanks for listening, guys. And before we sign off here, we wanted to give a quick shout out to our patrons over on patreon.com/Managing Madrid. It's been an absolute honor getting to know you guys and seeing this Real Madrid family grow, and you guys are a big part of it, and we wanted to thank you. And we also wanted to give a shout out to our $10 plus patrons specifically, because if you pledge $10 or more, not only do you get access to our entire back catalog, plus guaranteed responses to all of your questions, but you also get a specific shout out on the podcast. So shout out to these $10 plus patrons as follows: Brandon Alvarez, Willie Reed, Will Sousa, Wei Paring, Wamik Jamal, Tobias Royo Botcher, Tahmid Kalam, Sushank Demala, Sujai Wani, Sumanchu Singh, Sheikh Hatiri, Sergio Arispe, Santos Solorzano, Samuli Justin, Samer Z, Sai Mohan, Sasi Kumar, Rodrigo Balmaceda, Rishi D, Phoenix, Peter Powell, Paulo Fierro, Patrick Diafari, Oscar Barrera, Omar Barawani, Nico Laxo, Nicholas Moeller, Nick Ribeiro, Nelson Masariego, Naveen Babu, Ramesh Babu, Mowgli, MJ Diego, Michael Zinberg, Marin Myrtle, Matthew Atkins, Martin Ridman, Magnus Lext, Logan Stahl, Leon Stavronakis, Kunal Tilakar, Crystal Glass, Kevin Rivera, Jose Osorio, John Fernandez, Jeff Soa, Jason Fitz, Jacob P, Ian Marley, Howard Moore, Graham Gerard, Gary Kohut, Frederick Rantakiro, Frederick Sundros, S.A. Davisito, Ernesto Gutierrez Vargas, Eloy Enriquez, Edward Sossman, Daniel Williams, Connor McMorrow, Christian Toff, Krishna Costa, Brennan Powers, Brandon Stevens, Arnab Mukherjee, Armand Gashi, Armando L, Anthony Tharp, Anirudh Singh, Andres Silvestre, Ananya Kumar, Alex Steiberg, Azaz Hussein, Adrian Rios, Adar Zulukovic, Adam Dorsey, Bella Chow, Varun, Ramtin Mahrur, Fabian Moreno, and Daniel Smith. You guys rock. Thank you so much. And Hala Madrid.